Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. My name is Claire Wheeler, and I'm a 3L at William & Mary Law School.
My name is Darren Ziegler, and I'm a 2L at William & Mary Law School.
And on behalf of the College of William & Mary, we, the Black Law Students Association, along with tonight's co-sponsors, the Center for Student Diversity, the William & Mary Student Assembly, the Lemon Project, and the Office of Diversity and Equal Opportunity, would like to welcome you to our annual symposium on race, law, and current events. Each year, William & Mary's BLSA chapter hosts a symposium that addresses contemporary legal and socio-political issues facing the Black or African American community. In light of the polarizing racialized events in recent years, ranging from the erosion of voting rights protection to controversial extrajudicial killings of a number of African Americans, William & Mary's BLSA chapter aims to use this year's annual conference as a vehicle to advance the national discourse on race relations.
In Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? He explored various socio-political and economic issues and laws that adversely affect the Black community. Dr. King's book sheds light on the role that America's racialized socio-political system plays in reinforcing the disparities Blacks face in the United States. Though Dr. King criticizes the government and the American socio-political order, he concludes that Blacks and other racial groups can ultimately unite to fight against poverty and injustice, to create a more fair and a more balanced system of government. Despite Dr. King's aspirational vision, many of us in 2015 are asking the same question that Dr. King posed in 1967. Where do we go?
This evening, we are thrilled to host a panel of distinguished scholars, social justice advocates, and trailblazers who will discuss where we have gone since 1967, what still needs to be done, and if it can even be accomplished. The sponsoring organizations all share the common objective of energizing students to use our educations to positively impact the lives of others. It doesn't matter whether you are a big fish in a small pond, or if your sphere of influence has a shorter reach. We each have an obligation to resist becoming complacent with the status quo.
Thank you all for joining us this evening for what we are certain will be an inspiring and invigorating discussion stemming from the question, where do we go from here? We also have the distinct pleasure of welcoming and introducing our law school dean, Dean Davison Douglas. Dean Douglas joined the William & Mary Law faculty in 1990 and has held a number of leadership positions at the law school. From 1997 until 2004, he was director of William & Mary's nationally acclaimed Institute of Bill of Rights Law. In 2005, he founded the law school's election law program, which he directed until 2008. In 2002, Dean Douglas was one of 11 professors from all colleges and universities in Virginia to receive the State Council of Higher Education in Virginia's highest honor for professors, its outstanding faculty. Dean Douglas has received the Walter Williams Award 5 times as William & Mary Law School's outstanding teacher. In 2009, he received the Plumeri Award for Faculty Excellence. Dean Douglas also served as the Goldberg Distinguished Visiting Professor at Cornell Law School in 2007, and as a visiting professor of law at the law schools at the University of Iowa, Emory University, University of Auckland, and University of Melbourne.
Dean Douglas graduated cum laude from Princeton and received his law degree from Yale. But Dean Douglas did not want to stop there. He loved Yale so much that he stayed to get a master's in philosophy, a master's and a PhD in history, and a master's degree from Yale's Divinity School. Prior to coming to William & Mary, Dean Douglas served as a law clerk for Judge Walter Mansfield on the Second Circuit and practiced as an employment law partner in a Raleigh, North Carolina firm. Dean Douglas is one of the nation's leading constitutional historians, and his scholastic accolades are plentiful. Dean Douglas is the author or editor of 7 books, such as Jim Crow Moves North, The Battle Over Northern School Segregation. He has also published articles in several of the nation's leading law reviews. Even though his schedule is extremely busy, Dean Douglas still finds time to share his passion with students by teaching a seminar on race and American legal history. In this course, Dean Douglas pushes students to be catalysts of change. Thank you, Dean Douglas, for your unwavering support of BLSA. And without further ado, please join us in welcoming Dean Douglas.
Well, good evening. Good evening. Thank you all for being here. You know, we were to gather 2 weeks ago on this particular evening, and as those of you who live in Winter may remember, it was snowing that night. We actually, it was really unfortunate because that weekend at the law school, we had about 3 or 4 conferences scheduled. It was sort of our big weekend of the year. They all got wiped out. And I got to tell you, all the others said, well, so that's it. We'll try again next year. But BLSA did not. As early as that evening, as the snowflakes were coming down, the leadership said, we're going to do this, and we're going to come back. And so here we are 2 weeks later. So thank you, BLSA, for bringing us back and making sure that this important event takes place. You know, every year, as mentioned, BLSA does hold an important symposium on pressing issues around race in American life. And you know, I was thinking about it. I was thinking about these remarks tonight, and so much of what's been in the news the last few weeks, few months around race in America, and I wanted to say, you know, it's particularly appropriate that we've gathered this year. And then I thought about it, and I said, you know, it's particularly appropriate that we gather every year. The news is strong this year. The news is strong every year. So I want to really thank BLSA for putting together a marvelous program and for their persistence in continuing despite the weather, because we really do have a wonderful group of folks to reflect with us this evening. I want to brag on BLSA, if I can, for a few minutes, so indulge me, particularly for those of you who are outside the William and Mary community. Our Black Law Students Association chapter is consistently one of the best in the nation. And why do I think so? Well, for 6 of the last 7 years, they have been named the Mid-Atlantic BLSA Chapter of the Year of all the law schools in this part of the country. In 2009, they were the National Chapter of the Year. In 2012, they were the runner-up National Chapter of the Year. So they've had extraordinary success. So what's so special about the BLSA chapter here? I think there are a couple things. First of all is the very powerful and creative programming that they put on throughout the year, not just the symposium that we're having here this evening, but their regular speaker series or the other events that they host throughout the year that enrich the life and the dialogue and the debate at the law school, but also the phenomenal commitment to service. We have a strong commitment to service as a law school, and there are many student groups who engage in service, but no one surpasses BLSA in its particular commitment. And so these pieces together have led to just a remarkable student organization that really is one of the stalwarts of the law school. Our students also, our BLSA students recently competed in the Thurgood Marshall mock trial competition. This is a competition that involves more than 90 teams from around the country. And this past weekend, our team came back with the 3rd place finish. Which is another really outstanding achievement. And so I want to thank, we have 2 former BLSA presidents in the audience, or current and former, Matthew Kimmelek and Michael Roy. You guys have really carried the tradition, and I know that those who succeed you will do likewise. I want to really single out, though, Bellama Idana Boye. How did I do, Bellama? Was that pretty good? That was all right. We were practicing. Events like this don't happen unless somebody really drives it and takes it. And so many of the speakers, Bellama, were telling me what an extraordinary job you've done at organizing this, and I so agree, and thank you for doing this. And I do want to thank our co-sponsors, the Center for Student Diversity, the Lemon Project, the Office of Diversity and Community Engagement, and the William and Mary Student Assembly. Let me now turn to our speakers, and I want to give a brief introduction, and then we're going to jump into the proceedings. I'll start with our two moderators. We have two moderators that will lead us this evening. The first is Vivian Hamilton. Vivian is a professor at the law school. She's an expert in family law, particularly interested in the rights of young people, and is a graduate of Harvard Law School. Her co-moderator is Professor Jamel Donner from the William and Mary School of Education. He is the editor of the book, The Resegregation of Schools, Race and Education in the 21st Century. And Professor Donner received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin. And now as our panelist, if you'll just sort of wave your hand as I introduce you, Professor Eddie Cole, also of the William and Mary School of Education, where his focus is on the history of our higher education, particularly minority-serving institutions. Professor Andre Cummins, next, is the Vice Dean and Professor of Law at Indiana Tech Law School, and he's the author of the book, Reversing Field, Examining Commercialization, Labor, Gender, and Race in 21st Century Sports Law. He's a graduate of Howard Law School. Professor Adrian Wing is next on the platform. Point of personal privilege, Adrian and I were college classmates, so we've had a great time getting back together. Adrian is the Murray Professor of Law at the University of Iowa. She's also the director of the Iowa Center for Human Rights. She has been an international human rights lawyer and has provided advice to those drafting the constitutions of South Africa, Rwanda, and Palestine. She's a graduate of Stanford Law School. Professor Greg Carr. Professor Greg Carr is a professor of Africana Studies and the chair of the African American Studies Department at Howard University. He also teaches at Howard Law School. He is a co-founder of the Philadelphia Freedom Schools Movement, a community-based initiative involving more than 13,000 students, also a lawyer, a graduate of Howard Law School. Ms. Monique Dixon. Ms. Dixon is with one of the most important civil rights organizations of the past century, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where she is senior counsel for criminal justice and education. Prior to joining LDF, she was director of the Criminal and Juvenile Justice Program of the Open Society Institute and a graduate of the University of Maryland Law School. And finally, Ms. Jessica Pierce. Ms. Pierce is the national co-chair of the Black Youth Project 100 Coordinating Council. Prior to her current position, she worked for the NAACP as the National Training Director, and she is a graduate of the University of California at Santa Cruz, where she was president of the Student Union for 2 years. We have a great panel, and I now turn the program over to Professor Hamilton if you'll lead us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Douglas. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. I'm actually going to turn things over to Professor Donner, who will speak for just a few minutes, just a very few minutes, on the book that has sparked today's conversation. And then we will begin with the rest of our program.
Yes. First written in one of the few times in his adult life in which he was free from the demands of the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King took stock of how far the movement had come, as well as its signature accomplishments, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. As always, looking ahead, Dr. King prophetically asked, where do we go from here, chaos or community? Moving beyond the moral and legislative victories, Dr. King in this book sought and articulated a deeper understanding of the causes and effects of racial inequality in America, addressing the systemic nature as well as the corrosive effect of poverty on society and those who resided within it through no fault of their own. Dr. King also discussed the federal government's role in ameliorating structural inequality by guaranteeing a livable wage, adequate housing, and access to quality education. Dr. King also talked about urban youth disillusionment, the rhetorical allure of Black power, and how if the latter did not go beyond the catchy slogan, white allies would be alienated. Finally, in moving beyond discussing the storm warnings, Dr. King, in asking, where do we go from here, chaos or community, he was asking all of us, not just as citizens, but also as human beings, who are we and who do we want to be? Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to take 1 minute to describe the program, and just so that everyone knows what to expect. We're going to begin by giving each panelist a few minutes, to make some opening remarks, beginning with Professor Eddie Cole. And once we have heard from all of our panelists, Professor Donner and I will lead a discussion, and we've got some questions for them. And I think that this first part of our discussion will take about an hour. The remainder of the time, it is important for us that this be a conversation and that everyone here be included. And so following this first hour, everyone in the audience is welcome to come up to the microphones and direct questions to our panelists. So with that, Professor Eddie Cole.
Thank you, thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm going to give a brief introduction on higher education within the context of Dr. Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. So if you will, go back with me to the winter of 1960. And Warner T. Gibbs had called the campus of North Carolina A&T State University, a historically Black college, home for 34 years by that point. He arrived on the campus in 1926, where he started working as an instructor of military science. That was a fitting position considering that he had served as a second lieutenant within an all-Black unit of the U.S. Army for World War I. So combining his military experience and considering that Gibbs experienced North Carolina A&T worked through the Great Depression, he saw the enrollment dwindle as it went through World War II started, and more men students enlisted and went off and served, or were drafted and went off and served. As well as in 1956, he was named president of the college. And in 1959, the institution earned accreditation. So imagine after his more than 40 years of leadership experience, in the winter of 1960, he faced a challenge, one that he would later call new and, quote, unusual. He was 68 years old at that time. That's a lot of experience to be facing a new challenge. And so on Monday, February 1st, 1960, 4 North Carolina A&T students walked from the campus to downtown Greensboro's F.W. Woolworth's department store, a 5-and-dime store. And so after making a few smaller purchases throughout the department store, they eventually made their way to the whites-only lunch counter. While there, they asked to be served. Of course, they were denied because of their race. After refusing to leave their seat at the whites-only lunch counter and having management and local law enforcement come and tell them to leave, they refused to leave. And eventually, for that day, the Woolworths closed. And peacefully, the 4 students walked back to North Carolina A&T's campus. Seemingly small and perhaps even harmless, that was the start of a decade's worth of student-led activism on college campuses. Now for the rest of that week, the first week in February 1960, we see the protests grow. So 4 students on the first day. By Saturday, February 6th, there were more students in Woolworth's lunch counter area than they could accommodate. Eventually, a bomb threat was called in to the store, and everything shut down. If you're not going to serve Black people, we're not going to serve anybody. The next week on Tuesday, February 9th, the chancellor of the University of North Carolina Women's College, we know it now as UNC Greensboro, he delivered a speech to the student assembly, and he instructed students to stop protesting for two reasons. One, protests in the early 1960s would only ruin the racial progress that had been accomplished as of 1960. And then the second point was fear of violence. Now, he gave this speech, which is interesting, but it didn't stop anything, because within 1 month, several similar protests, sit-ins were happening across North Carolina. 10 other cities in North Carolina, 7 in Virginia, across the South. In fact, the student movement of the early 1960s went beyond the South. Nice examples I like to refer to are Madison, Wisconsin. Black students at the University of Wisconsin protested the Woolworths downtown Madison in solidarity with blacks in the South that could not dine at the lunch counter. Similar protests happened in Baltimore, Maryland, and Englewood, New Jersey. So with the nation's attention on the epicenter of where this all started, North Carolina, on March 3rd, 1960, Governor Luther Hodges wrote a letter to the president and the chair of the Board of Trustees for each state-supporting institution in his state. Enclosed with that letter was a copy of Gordon Blackwell's speech, which told students to stop protesting. He sent that letter telling the presidents that this speech deserved your, quote, very careful consideration. So that paints the picture of what college presidents were facing. As thousands of students were protesting across the nation, thousands, we think of Dr. King's question, community or chaos, where college presidents were asking, activism or caution.
Professor Dre Cummings.
I'm delighted to be here, and I wanted to very quickly express gratitude, first of all, to the law school here at William & Mary and to Dean Douglas for his support of this event. I've been very impressed with the BLSA organization. Thank you so much for sponsoring this event, particularly BLSA. Not even going to try the last name, but I appreciate the excellent opportunity that's been presented here. Also, I'm really grateful to be a part of this great panel. With my fellow panelists, particularly my very good friend Adrian Wing and my former colleague at West Virginia University Law School, William Hamilton. So I was fortunate on Martin Luther King Day this year to speak in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where my law school, Indiana Tech Law School, is, at the Mount Zion Tabernacle Church. And I had the opportunity to speak to maybe 400 or 500 people that had filled the church. And I was asked a question that I think everyone asks on Martin Luther King Day, which is, has Martin Luther King's vision, his dream, been realized? And I think that that question is answered differently depending upon the audience. Obviously, to me and to the Mount Zion Tabernacle Church, which was primarily African American, the answer is no, and not even close. And so to answer the question, community or chaos tonight, I will argue and posit that we live today in 2015 in racial chaos. And until we actually reform two very important areas of the law, we will continue as a country to live in racial chaos. We have to reform policing in the United States. We have to. And we have to reform carceral policy. We have to reform prison policy. If we do not do those two things, it is my opinion that we will never see the dream or the racial equality that Martin Luther King envisioned in the 1960s. Let me talk about those things for a couple of seconds. I grew up in Los Angeles, California. I lived in this very interesting stretch of land between Carson and Compton, California, and Redondo Beach and Manhattan Beach. And so my high school was primarily, it was my majority minority, and there were about 20% of African American, white, Asian, Latino, and Polynesian. So it was a very interesting mix of people. I hung out with surfers, and I hung out with, for lack of a better word, gangsters, if you will, Polynesian and African American. And I learned something at a very early age as a high schooler. My surfer friends smoked marijuana. They smoked marijuana in copious amounts. And my gangster friends smoked marijuana in copious amounts. The surfer friends were never stopped by the police, ever. It was as if they had immunity. They could smoke marijuana up and down the beach cities of California. My African American and Polynesian friends were stopped all the time. Whenever we were together, we were stopped. Our cars were illegally searched. I didn't know that at the time, but having gone to law school now, I realized that our cars were illegally searched. And I learned about hyperpolicing of minority communities. And I learned about siege mentality. And I wrote about this a very long time ago. This idea in policing that it's an enemy versus the good guys. It's us against them. And the enemy becomes, in hyperpolicing, minority faces, minority communities. We have to reform policing such that preserving human life is the ultimate law. We talk and debate about deadly force and the stop and frisk, and we debate all of these things when ultimately the prevailing fundamental anchor of policing should be preserving human life, and that's not the case today. And we have to reform the way we police in the United States, particularly minority communities, if we're ever going to see equality. Finally, I wanted to mention just quickly reforming carceral policy, or reforming our prisons. One of my primary research interests of the last couple of years has been centered on the corporatization and profit motive of private prisons. Very few people that I speak to, and I speak to a lot of audiences, realize that over 26% of our prisoners today are housed in private prison facilities, which means that corporations have the opportunity in the United States today to profit based on human misery and the number of people that they can get locked up behind bars. And what that means essentially for us in our prison policy is that for many prisons in the United States, they are incentivized perversely to incarcerate more people, to keep those prisoners in, that's my time's up, to keep people in prison more, for lengthier prison terms, to develop new laws to incarcerate in ways that we haven't in the past. And in my view, if we don't clear our prison policy of private prisons, we will continue to be the world's greatest incarcerator, which we are today. We incarcerate more human beings per capita than any country in the world, and we should be ashamed of that. And that's something that I hope we can talk about in greater detail in the question and answer. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cummings. I apologize. My timer, I thought, was on vibrate. I do take my job as timekeeper very seriously. Professor Adrienne Winning.
Thank you very much, Professor Hamilton. I believe this is my third time speaking at William & Mary. I was here a couple of weeks ago as the only member of this group. I arrived a day early, as I have to do coming from Iowa, had a lovely dinner with Professor Hamilton, Donner, and several of the students here. The weather was beautiful when we were then told everything will be canceled the next day, and I had a lovely time at the Holiday Inn and Suites. I mean that seriously, I had a wonderful time there. So I was so happy to be able to come back. That this was being redone, and I was available, and I would like to join all of my colleagues. I'm sure all of us have spoken many places in the country and abroad, and in my view, with 28 years as a professor, this is the best organized student event I have ever been at. Our honor and privilege to be with you at such a wonderful event. I have sent the big document to my BLSA and a bunch of other BLSAs that, look, you guys need to get on the ball here. Look what they have done at William & Mary. So this is so fabulous. The topic that I'm going to talk about is Martin Luther King's global perspectives, which are very little known. As you heard a bit, I have a background, I do international human rights, I do law in the Muslim world, I do women's rights, And I've been all over the world, and I can tell you from South Africa to the Gaza Strip, people use the nonviolent techniques of Martin Luther King in their efforts to combat injustice. That's the first thing they use. Now, those techniques might not work, and they might have to get involved in actual violent struggle, or at least some of the people involved in a struggle will end up going to violence. But everywhere, they always start with the nonviolent technique in attempting to confront power. And we often are not aware that they will praise Dr. King for what he was willing to do way back in the middle of the 20th century. So out of this book, where do we go from here, Chaos or Community? There are a number of places where his perspectives on international affairs are revealed. And some of you may or may not know that he was speaking out more and more against the Vietnam War near the time he was assassinated. Some have speculated that perhaps it were these views that were considered so dangerous to the many forces that wanted to see him dead. So, for instance, he noted the global nature of racism. He said, "Racism is no mere American phenomenon. In fact, racism and its perennial ally, economic exploitation, provide the key to understanding most of the international complications of this generation." He must be talking about right now, right? He thus joined W.E.B. Du Bois, who had recognized in 1903 that the problem of the 20th century was likely to be the problem of the color line. And as we see in the 21st century, these issues of color, ethnicity, and so on are still with us. Dr. King indicated our global arrogance. The Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. He went on to note, Western civilization is particularly vulnerable at this point, for our material abundance has brought us neither peace of mind nor serenity of spirit. And he linked our arrogance to militarism. Why have we substituted the arrogant undertaking of policing the whole world for the high task of putting our own house in order? Our government must depend more on its moral power than its military power. Plus, he exposed the imbalance between military and domestic spending. We squander war on money, even then spending 5 times what we did on anti-poverty programs. He has aptly captured what happens to a society that is so war-focused. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. He linked the global to the national. The security we profess to seek in foreign adventures, we will lose in decaying cities. Equality with whites will not solve the problem of either whites or Negroes if it means equality in a world stricken by poverty and in a universe doomed to extinction by war. He exclaimed, "We must solve poverty on an international scale." Now, everything I have just read to you is as relevant today as it was when he said it. I dare say, of my 8 grandchildren that I have, when they are grandparents, that all of these things will still be relevant. It could be very depressing. But fortunately, I have faith in your generation. The boomers, we've pretty much messed up a lot of stuff here. But given the great promise that all of you show in this room by what you've done in your lives so far, I know that we will get to the mountaintop. I hope to be there to see that. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Greg Carr.
Thank you, Professor Hamilton. And glad to be here at William and Mary. It's my first time on campus, first time in the city. It won't be my last. We loaned you all Michael Roy from Howard and classed up the joint a little bit, so thank you, brother. But glad to be here. Professor Donner, thank you for framing the book, Where Do We Go From Here? That was well done in a split second, man, to put all those together. And of course, by going on, Professor Wing, to kind of flesh that out even further in terms of King's global vision, I think that was very, very powerful. I've never been stopped for smoking weed. One time I smoked it, I laughed so hard, I said, I can't smoke weed anymore. So, but that's very familiar, Professor, coming in Washington, D.C., about who gets stopped for smoking marijuana, who doesn't. 8-to-1 ratio in terms of blacks getting stopped for it in D.C. before the recent legislation. But I want to pick up with something that Professor Cole, my homie, said. We went to Tennessee State together, so not together. I was there a long time before he was, in time and space. But it's interesting because time and space in many ways collapse when we think conceptually. And we think about King in ways that really don't reflect who he was. We freeze him in time, and he's right now frozen on the mall with his arms crossed, looking across the bay at Thomas Jefferson, which I love that pose. I love the Chinese sculptor who really captured that. It's almost like a Maoist kind of piece, man, that kind of monumental piece. I didn't want a subservient king looking down like that little bust in the Capitol Rotunda. I wanted the cat looking across like I ought to come out this rock and come right across and ask you about Sally Hemings, brought to the point. Because this is Mr. Jefferson's university before there was the University of Virginia, right? It was this beef with William and Mary that led him to go to Charlottesville. But in this space, I think it's important for us to remember that this notion of resistance has been consistent for black people since the first Africans under the British got brought here to Jamestown, right down the road. And it's important at this moment that we convene. But you asked me to talk a little bit about young people, youth movement, black power as it relates to where do we go from here. And I'm watching because I don't want your phone to get me, so I'm gone. No, I'm glad because I'm going to stay on task here in opening and invite us to think about the messiness of history and how when we knead it up, we evade the fundamental contradictions. It was W. Du Bois who wrote in 1890, I guess 7 it was, in the suppression of the African slave trade in the United States of America. At the very end, he said, no one would have looked on with more horror at the events of the Civil War than the Founding Fathers. They couldn't have imagined it. But his point was that if you don't cure a fundamental flaw in the structure of society, it's going to keep coming back. This is the fundamental challenge in this experiment called the United States. There's no guarantee there's going to be a United States in 50 years or 100 years. That's up to us. And King brings that up in Where Do We Go From Here? That was actually the theme of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference meeting in 1967. The first week of August, he gives a talk, Where Do We Go From Here? And he talks about these themes. By then, his movement is beginning to disintegrate. The young people don't want to hear it anymore, not in the same way. Those of you who saw that beautifully shot and directed, but very, very, very deeply flawed narrative called Selma, that film, didn't get a sense of that. The evasion of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a daughter of this region, Ella Jo Baker, who was running King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference the year after the Montgomery boycott ended, and they started SCLC. Ella Baker is invited by those young people you hear Dr. Cole talk about to come in and help us organize, because SCLC comes into existence in some ways. I like the way a brother named Chappelle, who's written a recent book about this, calls SCLC a moving target. In other words, if we can localize you in Alabama, we can localize you in Mississippi, we can maybe move against you. But SCLC becomes a national organization that takes advantage of the church-led, culturally grounded boycott movements that have been going on that came, some of them before, like Baton Rouge, what happened in Montgomery, and some of them came after. But at any rate, the young people meet right down the road at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1960 and say, we're going to start our movement. By then, SCLC has emerged. Dr. King is emerging, but you see the tensions also begin to emerge. This direct action thing is real. Now, you know, when we think about the period between 1960, the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and 1967, where do we go from here, chaos or community, what we see is King being pulled by events and by this movement into a more radical position than he had begun with. It's not to say that he wouldn't have gotten there on his own, but these young people are moving very quickly. In some ways, in fact, I know this is the opening remarks, so I'm kind of wind this to a close by, I'm watching, what have I got, about 2 minutes? I'm good. All right. So, no, but because we're going to stay on task. Really, we definitely, Professor Hamilton's right. We want to hear from y'all. This needs to be a conversation night. This is a rare opportunity. When you see, for example, the Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, and the Fair Housing Act of 68, it should remind us today that we say Black life matters. That's the hashtag, right? But in this country, Black death matters more. Black suffering matters more. Each one of those pieces of federal legislation comes as a consequence of brutalization of Black people. Civil Rights Act 64 doesn't get passed if you don't have the Birmingham campaign and those young people, particularly children, putting their lives on the line in Birmingham. The Voting Rights Act doesn't get passed if you don't have bloody Selma, the bloody confrontation on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. We get stuck there. Here's a little bit of Virginia history, right? Amelia Boynton, who's 103 years old, came across that bridge on a wheelchair next to President Obama. She and her husband were participating in the Dallas Equal Rights League, the Voting Rights League in Dallas County, which is where Selma is, since the 30s. Their son left Alabama, went to Howard Law School. That boy trying to get home for break, stops at a place at the bus station to eat, about, what, 40, 50 miles from here in Richmond. That's Boynton versus Virginia. Y'all read that case, right? Did y'all know that the son who had that case, the brother, was the son of the folks who were fighting for voting rights years before Martin King came to Selma? But it was the young people who shamed their elders in Selma by walking out of the segregated high school and saying, we're not putting up with this anymore. We can't vote, but we will protest. It was then their parents who called in Martin Luther King. Let me wind this to a close by saying, by the time you get to King in 67, you've got a king who has moved. And you know, I really do appreciate that, Professor Wing, because you really framed that. His anti-Vietnam War stance is what brought Stokely Carmichael and them back into the orbit and said, okay, maybe you're serious about this. Because in 1964, Freedom Summer, those young people, led by high school students in Mississippi, had come out against the heightening of aggressions in Vietnam. King was a hated dude in 1968. By some surveys, 3/4 of the country was against him. And a lot of Negroes were scared of him. He is now safely dead, so we can praise him. But when you read Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos and Community, he has some very serious conversations about the relationship between love and power, the relationship between organization and economic power, the use of boycotts, but then the bullet strikes him. And then that's how Lyndon Johnson gets the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Arguably, if Dr. King isn't assassinated, we don't get the FHA of 1968. Black death matters more in this country. And we have to remember that we can't just talk about I have a dream. Dr. King gave his life. And in the years after that, whether it be the Humphrey Hawkins Bill of 1977 and Jimmy Carter's evasion of deep teeth federal legislation, because what King says, there ought to be a right to a job in this country. When's the last time you heard anybody say that? We haven't really talked about Martin King, but we could talk about it tonight a little bit if we want to really think about this question of where do we go from here, because he has some very serious ideas about that. Thank you. Yes.
Dixon.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for inviting the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to this very timely panel discussion. I'm very honored to represent an outstanding organization, the Legal Defense Fund, which celebrated its 75th anniversary this weekend. And so I want to spend some time in my remarks just giving you a little background information about who the Legal Defense Fund is and our work in the criminal justice reform space, and then talk about how Martin Luther King and others struggle for social and economic justice so many years ago continues today, and what that looks like for people with criminal records. So I wanted to pick up on some of the talking points that Professor Cummings laid out for us. So Legal Defense Fund, we were founded in 1940 by Thurgood Marshall, who later became our first African-American Supreme Court Justice. For 75 years, we've worked for racial equality, racial justice, and an inclusive society. In many of the landmark Supreme Court cases, we were involved, Brown v. Board of Education. We're pretty well known for our work in the abolition of the death penalty in the criminal justice realm. But we've also had occasion over the years to do some police reform work, even before racial profiling returned to the national debate. after the series of killings we've experienced at the hands of police of African American men and women, and injuries of women over the years. We filed a lawsuit in New York City on behalf of public housing residents who were stopped, searched, and arrested for walking while Black and brown, talking while Black and brown on their own public housing facilities, or when they were visiting, and charged with criminal trespass, and that case is still pending. But we are increasingly finding ourselves filing litigation and pushing for policy reform to remove civil laws, civil barriers that people with criminal convictions face even after they have paid their debt to society. They've been incarcerated, or they are on probation or parole, yet there continues to be barriers faced by people with criminal records that they were not aware of prior to being incarcerated. So I don't know if you know, but the American Bar Association has a collateral consequences project that it just completed, and it found 46,000 laws and regulations that block people with criminal convictions from fully participating in society. The most well-known, as many of you know, people with criminal felony convictions are not allowed to vote in many states across this country, including Virginia. Some of those rights may be restored after individuals request it. You know, have to go through a cumbersome process to get those voting rights restored. Also, in the area of employment, over the years, there's been more private and public employers look at criminal background registries and do background checks, and even the most insignificant old criminal convictions that they find can block individuals from employment, and this is happening more now than it was 50 years ago. And when you look at that and consider the fact that a recent study showed that a white person with a criminal record is more likely to be called back on interviews than a Black person without a criminal record, you understand how debilitating having a criminal record and being a person of color in this country is. And then in terms of federal benefits, this may not be as well known that people with felony convictions, a drug conviction in particular, is no longer eligible for food stamps or cash assistance unless states require that, they waive that removal of that right from their laws. So the good news is there's a movement afoot, and the movement is both at the state, local, and federal levels, and some of the movements are led by people with criminal records to remove those barriers. And the best way to remove it is so that, you know, to set up policies so that there's no entry into the criminal justice system. And where we're seeing a no entry movement is in school discipline. We know that many of you may have heard of the school to prison pipeline. Children of color are being targeted for discipline for minor infractions like disrespect of authority, and they're suspended and arrested and pushed out of school, many after decades of research showing that that doesn't work and is racially discriminatory. Many schools are now diverting more young people to in-school interventions to prevent them from entering the criminal justice system. And then at the state and local level, prosecutors offer deferred prosecution so that, you know, if you are charged with something and if you meet certain criteria, during a certain time period, the charges are dropped, and in some cases you can expunge your record. So that the no entry movement is moving forward. And then, you know, the re-entry movement is very active, where, you know, members of Congress and other activists are pushing for laws, changes in laws that allow you to expunge some of your criminal records, certain criminal records. One thing to look out for on the federal level, the Democracy Restoration Act will be reintroduced this year. It allows people who have a felony conviction to vote in federal elections, so you should keep that in mind and call your legislators and ask them to support that. And then there's something called the REDEEM Act that allows an individual to expunge their adult and juvenile records under certain circumstances, and as well as allows people to be eligible for food stamps and cash assistance. So, with that, I think that, where do we go from here? The struggle continues in terms of social and economic justice, but I think that we're moving forward. It'll take a long time to abolish those 46,000 civil laws that block people from becoming full members of society, but I'm encouraged that all of you in this room will be pushing for those changes in your careers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dixon. We'll now hear from Ms. Jessica Pierce of Black Youth Project 100.
Yeah. Hi. Hi, y'all. You can say hello. That's fine. I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about the context and the frame of the conversation we're discussing, as well as like the actual issues and the core of what we're discussing. So I was one of the original 100 co-founders of Black Youth Project 100, now serve as the co-chair of the organization. And usually I'm asked to come to speak at events, and people ask me to only speak to youth organizing or to talk about how the work of my organization differs in comparison to Al Sharpton or the NAACP, which is an organization I used to work for. And so part of this, like when I come to these spaces for me, is also redefining that frame in a lot of ways. So in a lot of ways, when we talk about this work or these issues of criminal justice, of violence, black is defined as what white is not, right? Womanhood and femininity is defined by what masculine is not. Youth is defined by what old is not, right? And I'm trying to reject that whole framework for how I approach my work. But what that looks like, right, in terms of practical application of those issues is it's perpetuating institutional racism. It's saying that if we save black men and support programs like My Brother's Keepers, then we'll save the black community. It's the erasure of the black female victims of police violence from this case, right? It's bringing young people to the table for faux leadership as opposed to actual leadership and voice and decision-making and power. And so in terms of like how we actually deal with that, right, and what that actually looks like for my organization, is what we focus on the recognition of these issues in an institutional context, right? None of these issues are about individual things, but usually what we do is we hold up the individuals. So we take the recent situation of SAU at the University of Oklahoma, and we're indicting the individuals as opposed to the system, right, as opposed to the organization, right? We applaud, expelling 2 students when 2 students really aren't the issue or the cause of violence or the reason why those students even thought it was okay to have that phrase be repeated on that bus, right? So it's like recognizing the system, it's indicting the system, it's fighting for structural changes, right? It's also controlling the narrative, I think, as well. I think about right now the fact that most of us, we can look around at each other, and I can probably ask you all to raise your hand or not if you know the names of Mike Brown or of Trayvon Martin, right? Or of Eric Garner, but if I ask you if you know Ayanna Jones or Rakia Boyd or Yvette Smith or Pearlie Smith or Tarika Wilson or Taisha Miller or Kayla Moore, I doubt that many people know who all of those women are, right? And these are black women, cisgendered and transgender women who have died at the hands of police violence. I hear people retell the statistic that just came out that says that every 28 hours a black person is killed by police violence or state-sanctioned violence. And I hear it retold as every 28 hours a black man is killed by police force. So part of what we do is retelling these stories, right? And even in a historical context, we look at the cases of MLK. We all know about the stories of the violence he faced or the arrests that he went under. But how many people know the story of Fannie Lou Hamer and the violence, physical and sexual violence that she faced at the hands of Mississippi police in 1963? That gave her the limp that she dealt with for the rest of her life. We don't tell those same stories in the same way. So part of the work that I do at Black Youth Project 100 is retelling these stories, talking about these women, rejecting these narratives that put us in an oppositional position where we focus on the individuals as opposed to the institutions. and really focus on building power and group-centered leadership. So even in our organization, the models that we take on are not just new models, they're also old models, right? So the models that we take on for how we structure and run our organization is most leadership of our organization is stipend. That's money that was fundraised similar to the seed funding for the initial positions of SNCC, right? Like we have responsibilities to fundraise in that same way. So we take the lessons in which we've learned from past work, because it's still the same civil rights movement. I also reject that narrative that like this is the new civil rights movement. This is still the same fight in a lot of ways, right? When we look at issues like voting rights and we talk about felons, right? We know that when we look at 2012 that there were more repeals and efforts to push back on voting rights in 2012 than there were when there were actual poll taxes, right? This is a continued fight. So we focus on what has worked and we build new systems for how we actually accomplish that work in new ways. But I wouldn't say it's new or radical, it's just a slight shift. It's building on best practices, it's working institutionally inside of these institutions and outside of these institutions for structural change that actually improves our lives.
Thank you. So we now have questions for each of our panelists, and we will start, we'll go in the same order in which they just spoke, beginning with Professor Eddie Cole. And Ms. Pierce's remarks are, I think, a good segue into the question that I was going to ask you. Professor Cole is our resident expert in the history of higher education. And like Ms. Pierce just noted, just last week, a video was released in which members of the University of Oklahoma's chapter of the fraternity SAE sang and danced to a racist chant that referenced lynching and referred to the exclusion of the N-word from the fraternity. The university president, David Boren, immediately shut the chapter down and expelled the students involved. His actions received both praise and criticism. So my question for you, Professor Cole, is, was President Boren's response the right one? How should university administrators respond to these sorts of incidents, and what advice do you have for students, both students of color and white students at the University of Oklahoma and elsewhere, who must witness what is probably not an isolated expression of racial intolerance?
Great question. First off, I want to say, in addition to studying the history of higher education, the timing of this is incredible because I'm working on a project right now that examines the rhetoric of college presidents in response to racial incidents on campus. So I just finished writing about this last week. And so first off, and I'm going to echo a lot of what my colleague Ms. Pierce just said, but first off, it's too early to tell. So we have to be careful about crowning the president at this point because we haven't seen much action. We're still caught up in the rhetoric, for one. But also, you know, his swift action has been, it's been all the rave in a lot of circles this week. And I think his motivations are generally in the right place. You know, he wants to stop future races, but like any college president, it's a public relations opportunity. So regardless of whenever the cameras show up on your campus, that's an opportunity to show something good about your university, regardless of the situation. So if he can outcast those two students and show them as outliers to the University of Oklahoma community, you know, that's the basics. You know, that's crisis management 101 that college presidents go through. So you think about college presidents, I think about these two dueling battles that's happening. It's the public relations fight as opposed to the fight for equality in reality on campus. So he missed an opportunity that most presidents missed that I noted in my recent study, in that he did not address the institutional racism that caused something like that by the fraternity to happen. So we get so caught up in his statement and what he said that we miss what wasn't said. And what I like to call, what presidents tend to do is they address the racist but not the racism. And in doing so, they missed this huge opportunity. Most presidents, 5 out of 6 presidents, are going to allude to the individuals that committed the act, but not necessarily the institutional structures that fostered it. So a couple action items, thinking about students, regardless of black, white, student of color. First off, I want to target administrators as well. There's something about this opportunity to actually sit in a room and address these institutional structures that are in place. Higher education in America was not founded on this idea of being inclusive. Let's be honest about that. So historically speaking, it's a couple centuries later. In my history of higher ed course, I talk about this. It's 200 years later before we even start to diversify who the students are, let alone institutional missions and so forth. Second off, we can think about what would a new student orientation look like if social justice activities were actually brought up the moment you set foot on campus. Like, let's talk about it. But we pass on that opportunity and get more into fight songs and things to do and so forth. Let's talk about real issues. And then the last thing that I think students really have control over, and it goes back to what we saw in the 60s and 70s, students have an influence on what the curriculum becomes. You think about cultural studies programs that emerged in the 1970s. University of Massachusetts Amherst and the University of San Francisco are 2 examples to where their entire school of education has social justice weaved into each course. It's part of their mission. It's what they do. So you can't run from it. If you don't want to talk about social justice, you don't go to those programs. So that's an opportunity that we can do instead of having an isolated, standalone diversity course, maybe even as an elective. We had an opportunity to think about what can faculty do with the student input to really weave these issues within the overall issues facing college campuses.
I'd like to give our other panelists an opportunity to weigh in as well, briefly. If any of you choose.
30 seconds.
Okay.
I found it astonishing. I assume you all did too, to watch the video of the chanting on the bus. It was gleeful. It was joyful. It was, it was astonishingly well known. Men and women singing this song. 2 students get expelled. The fraternity gets disbanded, but as Brother Cole was saying just now, not a word about what permeates college campuses and what white people do when they don't think anyone's watching, as far as race is concerned. And until we actually have real concrete action and conversation and deterrence, I think this kind of thing happens. Well, I know it does because I've been able to be on the inside and the outside of those kinds of conversations.
I would just add, beyond conversation, there has to be punishment. And there's absolutely no way that this system gets dislodged unless it's no longer profitable. University of Oklahoma makes a lot of money off black bodies. Their president's no fool. In Alabama, y'all probably saw last week, University of Alabama, there's an African-American who's student body president. He beat what they call the machine. Those of you who know anything about the University of Alabama know they got this network of fraternities, sororities, elites that kind of do this. Senator Cotton from Arkansas and 46 of his buddies sent a letter to the Iranian government and says, y'all ain't got to listen to that nigger. There'll never be a nigger in charge of the United States of America. Now, I'm changing the words, obviously, the fraternity chant, but my point is that there is a sense of entitlement that comes with an elite structure. And many folks who are non-white people of color, because whites are color too, right? I'm like T. Thomas Fortune in the 19th century. Once you say people of color, what you've done is decenter humanity. You've said there are people, that means white, and people of color. It's like saying, black Jesus. But at any rate, the point, there's Jesus and there's black Jesus, but the point is that there is no punishment. The elite want to run the place the way they want it, and what many of us want is access to that conversation. So that when these things happen, it's easy to say, oh my God, get rid of those few people. Yeah, but can I be the one that y'all let in? This is what King was talking about when he said that the black elite have turned their back. We're negotiating for access, not to displace the system. So I don't think this thing gets solved at all, because there's still no risk of that system being dislodged.
I wanted to add something about the international perspective on hate speech, because of course there's a lot of people saying, well, it's freedom of speech and you can say whatever, and then there are other people saying, yeah, but they're also talking about lynching, and there have been people lynched and people who've fostered that. Well, you all saw what happened in France recently with terrorism, etc. But in France and in a lot of Europe, they have hate speech laws. And so there was there's a designer, what's his name, Galliano, or? No, not them. It's a guy, Galliano, right, he was drunk in a bar in Paris, and he saw a woman. He thought she was Jewish, and he called her some anti-Semitic thing, and then said the B word. Now, that probably happens all over the country in the U.S. all the time. All kinds of bad words are said in bars, and nothing happens in the U.S. Well, in France, he got convicted and had to pay a 6,000 euro fine for saying that in the bar. Like I said, a lot of other European countries, they have these rules where it is a criminal offense to speak in such ways. So even though these are allies and democracies, there are many ways to look at what people are saying. In Germany, one cannot talk about being a Nazi. In South Africa, one cannot call for the return of apartheid. So when we here are trying to configure our doctrines or think about where they should go, we also need to look at where lots of other countries already have gone in addressing these very hurtful and potentially dangerous language that's used.
This next question is directed toward Professor Cummings. And you kind of talked about this earlier in your opening remarks about needing to rethink, reframe the criminal justice system. And so, in a recent speech to Georgetown University students and faculty, the FBI Director James Comey, in discussing the often tense relationships between law enforcement and neighborhoods of color, talked about the need to discuss some quote-unquote hard truths. One of those truths was the widespread existence of unconscious bias and how law enforcement react differently to blacks and white faces. How do we begin to have that hard conversation while acknowledging and respecting the challenging nature of the work of law enforcement, particularly in communities of color?
Thank you. Let me preface what I'm about to say by letting you know that my brother is a police officer. He's a police officer, was in Palo Alto, California, now he's in Salt Lake City. We've had many, many robust conversations about policing in the United States, and he's a very smart guy too. And so I have a deep amount of respect for the challenging nature of the job and the fact that every time he goes to work, something bad could happen in his trying to keep the country safe. So I have a huge amount of respect for people that engage in law enforcement. However, I think there's a way to do law enforcement that protects our communities and doesn't harm them, and particularly communities of color. So first, to answer the question about how do we have the hard conversation, we have to acknowledge first that we engage in hyper-policing in minority communities. We have to acknowledge that that happens. Michelle Alexander, in her wonderful book, The New Jim Crow, makes this point very poignantly, where she says, we could have prosecuted the war on drugs anywhere. College campuses, frat houses, suburbia. I told you earlier, beach cities in California. But where do we prosecute the war on drugs? It's prosecuted in minority communities. That's where the police are able to scoop up the most amount of individuals that they can throw in prison with the least amount of resistance. Imagine if we busted everybody in frat houses and took them in, and their parents would descend upon both the police office, the police department, and the legislature. And we wouldn't have a war on drugs anymore if it were prosecuted in majority communities. But it's not. We made a conscious decision to hyperpolice. And consequently, our prisons are teeming with African American and Latino men primarily, but also women at extraordinarily disproportionate rates. So we have to start by acknowledging the hyperpolicing. Then we have to acknowledge that we have a law problem. And our law problem is this. Our laws are written in a way that justify the use of police force, that justify stand your ground laws, that justify deadly force use, instead of our laws being grounded in how do we preserve human life? How do we ensure that people get their day in court, not get buried? And that's a problem that we need to work hard to fix, is the law problem in the way that we define and allow and justify deadly force. Let me just say this. I told Professor Hamilton earlier, because we were being recorded, I might have to hold back a bit, but here's something that I'm not going to hold back on. Anytime an unarmed young man, and it's typically usually an unarmed black man, is murdered by police, it is never justifiable. Never justifiable. There are tools. My brother and I talk about this all the time. There are tools that officers have to use. It does not have to be a gun that will kill. They can use tasers. They can use batons. They can use beanbag guns. They can use all sorts of things. But when unarmed black men are shot dead, and to Ms. Pierce's point earlier, we know the famous names. There are dozens of names constantly that we don't know about. I just the other day, a mentally ill man running around naked in a neighborhood was shot dead. A mentally ill running around naked was shot dead by a police officer, African American, mentally ill man, white police officer. So we have to acknowledge that there's a law problem, and with it a training problem. So we have a training problem. If double tap to center mass is the way you're trained, then we have a hell of a problem, because we're talking about not life-threatening situations. And again, I really deeply respect the work that my brother does and that law enforcement across the country do, but double tap to center mass if there's a problem is not proper training, especially with the tools that police officers have now. All of the toolboxes, the weapons that they can use rather than double tap to center mass. And then finally, we have a bias problem. We have a bias problem. Because of siege mentality and because of implicit bias, we have police officers, many of whom have served in the military, many of whom are very sort of accustomed to this idea of us versus them, the siege mentality of let me protect my community against bad people, where community policing is not the training methodology which it should be. So let me give you two quick things to think about and read. First of all, a law professor and writer named David Dante Trout wrote this fabulous article in The Nation called "Is Racial Justice Possible in America?" Try and remember that, write it down, Google it, find that article, it's beautiful. David Dante Trout, "Is Racial Justice Possible in America?" And another law professor friend, Donald Tibbs, who teaches at Drexel Law School, wrote an article called "Who Killed Oscar Grant? A Legal Eulogy of the Cultural Logic of Black Hyperpolicing." Donald Tibbs, "Who Killed Oscar Grant?" I would suggest that you read both of those things. And then the last thing I'd like to say, and I'm sure I would have another opportunity, but just to make sure I do, it is so critical that we and you are activists. It's not a bad word. It is something that, armed with a legal degree, a law degree, or an upper or a education doctorate, or what have you, we have got to be activists. It's no longer good to talk about this. It's no longer good to meet together and say, damn, we've got problems. We have to be activists. And in my own little way, I'm trying. I'm meeting with a family now who has a Michael Brown situation in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I'm researching to see who are the corporations that benefit the most from free prison labor.
thinking about prison corporate boycotts. But we have to think hard about being activists and not just talk about the problem, but think about how we can be a part of the solution.
Thank you. Professor Wing. A recurring theme in recent Supreme Court opinions has been that the only way to overcome the problem of racial discrimination is to stop discriminating on the basis of race, even if the goal in doing so is to correct past discrimination. Last year in Chouette versus Coalition to Defend Affirmative Action, the Supreme Court upheld Michigan State's constitutional amendment that banned any consideration of race in admissions to the state's public universities. Other states have adopted similar measures, effectively banning affirmative action in college and university admissions. In light of these developments, what do you believe is the future of affirmative action? Do you believe that the use of racial preferences is still needed in university admissions, or anywhere for that matter? Or has this approach really run its course?
We have always had race-based preferences. For a couple of 100 years, those race-based preferences were to benefit the founding fathers group, white men with property. This was never considered a problem. It only became considered a problem when a few people of color and some women started to get access to institutions of power, and in particular certain fields like law. Nobody's worried about how many black music majors there are. That's not an issue. They want to cut the head off of the ability of oppressed communities and their allies to seek justice. I'm a beneficiary of affirmative action, as many of you all are in this room. Many of us cower if somebody says, oh, you only got into that place because of your race, meaning person of color race, or gender, or both. India started affirmative action soon after its independence in 1950 for the oppressed groups. They are still doing quota-based affirmative action, and they're barely making a dent in the centuries of the caste system that they have had. Why would we think that a few decades of policies that have permitted a tiny portion of an oppressed group to trickle up into a little bit of power is going to resolve the bigger problem of the continued oppression of the majority of people of color in the country? We have to take the rhetoric and say, there's always been the affirmative action. Texas abolished the so-called race-based affirmative action for the 10% plans. Lo and behold, we discovered the University of Texas Law School, like probably a lot of law schools and universities, are letting in mass numbers of politicians' children who are white, who did not have the top LSATs or GPAs, and this all got exposed recently, and it was embarrassing and so forth. So that is still going on. Nobody's saying cut off affirmative action for politicians' children, right? They're not. So I think we need to contest the idea of the quote you mentioned, and then of course Justice O'Connor said, well, maybe we should keep it, but only 25 years or so. 25 years is a drop in the bucket of history. Like I talked about my grandchildren, I'm sure we will still have these issues when they are grandparents about who accesses power. And shortly, in a few decades, people of color will be the majority of this country. Well, then what happens with school admission? Will we see the white minority say, oh, I've got to be let in, I've got to be let in? Or will it be like South Africa, where whites will be the numerical minority, but they will be able to keep power to still prohibit people of color from getting access to institutions of power? So look at our language, be activist, and don't let anybody back you into a corner and say, oh, we don't need this now, 25 years or 50 years is enough.
Professor Carr, Dr. King writes that many middle-class Negroes have forgotten their roots and are more concerned about conspicuous consumption than about the cause of justice. Do African Americans with a certain level of education and success have an obligation to assist other African Americans financially, socially, and educationally? Also, do you agree, for example, with your colleague and co-panelist, Professor Wing, when she characterizes Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas as, quote, an embarrassment and a disgrace to the memory of Thurgood Marshall? Do you believe in the concept or the notion of selling out?
That's easy, yes. Drop the mic, right? No. Prof, that's a difficult question. Let me start with the second one first, very quickly. I would agree with my colleague, Professor Wing. He is an embarrassment. Fortunately, there are two Africans on the Supreme Court. One of them speaks Spanish. If her name was Sonia Johnson and she was from Puerto Rico, we wouldn't be saying that she's, you know, it's funny, Latinos can come from anywhere. A Latina from New York with folks from Puerto Rico, the blood of Africa is in her veins, and thank God for that. And Sonia Sotomayor comes to Howard Law School. She's been there a couple of times, and so she spends some time at law school. It's just good. That's you know, I obviously don't know her like we kicking it or anything, but you just get the sense that this is a person who is trying very clearly to not just model what intellectual work looks like. Professor Cummings, it almost looks like trying to be an activist, almost to the degree that you can. But to Clarence Thomas' point, and I'm sure everybody in here has read, obviously, Fisher, the Fisher case. I love reading Clarence Thomas' dissents because they are clear. I don't know that I would agree with Jeffrey Toobin, who seems to think that perhaps 50 years from now we'll look back on the Supreme Court, that is, if there is a United States in 50 years. And I'm very serious about that. This polity is by no means set in stone. But look back, and Toobin seems to think somehow that Clarence Thomas's consistency may allow historians to reflect on him as some type of intellectual giant. Even for Jeffrey Toobin, that's a bit of a stretch. But the contradictions of historically black colleges and universities, and I say that having gone to one as an undergraduate and teach at one now, that Clarence Thomas raises in his dissent in Fisher, it's very important to contemplate, because it really speaks to the idea of black self-determination. And that can be very contradictory. In my mind, I think in many ways the black elite don't think black people can win. So they're looking for the best deal they can get. We can't win as a group, so let me negotiate. Cedric Robinson, in his book, Black Movements in America, talks about two divergent ideological strains in black communities in this country. You have the masses of African people, and certainly we don't have to have that conversation in Virginia without it resonating, because you can feel the enslaved Africans who worked in these fields around here. They're in this room. Those Negroes were concerned about living from day to day and resisting when they could, and ultimately imagining a world where they didn't do what they were doing. They respected the law, not for any sense of justice, but for its capacity to punish them. So when we start talking about reforming things in America, I'm saying, reform what? Reform presumes that there was some state that we're trying to somehow return to and make improvements on. This is a settler colony. It was set up to do what it's doing. The police are doing what they're supposed to do. You don't reform that. You try to perpetuate it. But what you see, Gerald Horne, if you read his book, well, any of Gerald Horne's work, but particularly his most recent book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, where he says that basically, and y'all ain't got to talk about this either because Yorktown's right down the road, right? When Lord Dunmore tells those Negroes, if you fight with the British, you can be free, so many of them run out there to George Washington and like, we got to give them some kind of deal like that, because otherwise they're going to run. And in this state alone, 30,000 ran away, at least 30,000. We don't give a damn who wins the American Revolution. But when Dunmore makes that overture, what is revealed is that these so-called founding fathers have to make a decision. Great Britain is much less invested in the question of black slavery than it is in the question of empire. They're willing to arm even black people. So George Washington, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, hell, I ain't left Virginia yet, have I? They say, look, we've got to do something to get away from these people. So you get the American Revolution. You talk about the French and Indian War and paying for the war and this kind of thing. But that's really where you see it. The fear that you may invest these human beings with a form of citizenship that we never anticipated or wanted them to have. So let's fast forward to now as I wind this up. Gerald Horne argues that somewhere in the 1950s, post-World War II, this country made a truce with the black middle class. Turn from the international stage, and we'll ease up on some of these inconveniences that you face. Think about the name William Patterson. That's a lawyer y'all should know. William Patterson ended up working on Angela Davis's case in the 1970s before he died, but his roots go back to the 1930s on the West Coast, working in labor movements. He comes forward in the Communist Party, works with Paul Robeson, Eslanda Robeson. You're right, we don't think about the women often. We need to do that. He is sold out. The NAACP moves away from him, even Thurgood Marshall. And Thurgood Marshall got some complicated history too. If you start looking at some of his kind of cleaves to the patriotic at moments when black radicalism could have used his voice. But the concession is that domestic policy eases a little. Brown versus Board, these kind of things. And the schools more segregated now than they were in the 1950s. In conclusion, the black middle class, however, that has been buoyed, that has been held aloft by mass movements in this country. Everything the black middle class has got, everything everybody in this room wants to have, and then get credit for having struggled to get it, is as a consequence of people who are out here suffering every day. And yes, the police job is dangerous, but I promise you right now, when we leave here tonight, the moment we're back to the hotel, if the police pull up behind me, I'm gonna tell you right now, I don't know if I survive to get to the Holiday Inn Express. That's my reality in this country. And I don't give a damn about the United States of America if it means I must continue as a consequence of my sacrifice to hold this polity together. And if the black middle class want to abscond their responsibility, I don't give a damn about them either. And I'm saying that as a member of that bourgeois class, because when you said conspicuous consumption, it reminded me of E. Franklin Frazier in 1957, wrote a book called Black Bourgeoisie, published first in France. Interesting, the French. Very interesting. When he says this question of conspicuous consumption is about people evading their responsibility. I don't have a lot of money, but I'm gonna buy this fur coat because I want you to think I'm somebody else. Ralph Ellison wrestled with that, and I feel sorry for that brother. Brilliant writer, but so deeply invested in the American project that it just ate his mind. And that's what well, anyway, let's just stop there. But yeah, the black middle class, they can go on too, if they want to.
Well, perhaps since Professor Wing, you were referenced in the initial question, I'll give you an opportunity, should you so choose, to contribute.
Yeah, I actually wanted to bring up some very interesting literature. My colleague at the University of Iowa, her name is Angela Onwuachi Willig. She wrote an article about Clarence Thomas where she looked at his jurisprudence and his life not as, well, is he a sellout? Is he a right-wing clone of Scalia or this kind of view? But instead saw him as part of a tradition of black conservatism that does exist to this day in the black community. And this article was very interesting. It was a perspective we had not really thought of. And as a result of this article, Justice Thomas invited her to his chambers. And she went there, and he was very gracious, very kind. By the way, he's refused to come to the University of Iowa after his colleague, Justice Scalia, had a overly warm welcome that Justice Scalia did not appreciate. In other words, the students protested. So Justice Thomas has refused to come to Iowa. And so anyway, but he did see her. He was happy about the article, etc. And so I recommend that article to you to see a whole nother view of Justice Thomas. And I just recently found out that when she was on the job market, she was given an offer by Drake, where Justice Thomas does go to speak every year. It's one of the 2 law schools in the state of Iowa. And she had an offer from Iowa, and he told her, don't go to Iowa. Whatever you do, don't go there. You should go to Drake Law School, which is, of course, a fine law school, but she was astonished that he wanted to make sure she didn't go the wrong way by going to Iowa. So take a look at her article.
Ms. Digson, you mentioned in your opening remarks, and I think we'd like you to comment further on what you and others have referred to as the school-to-prison pipeline. In your writings and earlier, you argue that students of color are disproportionately disciplined under zero-tolerance policies. And I'm not certain that everyone here is familiar with these policies, and so I was hoping that you could discuss the use of zero-tolerance policies in elementary and secondary schools, what they are, and the ways in which what seems to be a non-discriminatory policy that would seem to apply equally to all students can nonetheless, or is nonetheless negatively impacting students of color. And if you could talk a little bit more about possible alternatives that would better serve all students and young people.
Thanks for the question. I guess I'll start by saying that the educational system adopted zero-tolerance policies and practice from the criminal justice system. So as you all know, probably know, that zero-tolerance in criminal justice is police officers quickly and harshly punish minor infractions with an eye on preventing more serious infractions, right, criminal offenses. And we know how well that worked in the community, right? We can look at the stop and frisk practices in New York City that was ruled unconstitutional by federal court a few years ago because, you know, by the thousands, Black and brown residents of New York City were stopped, and no criminal action resulted from that. No criminal charges resulted. And also broken windows policy, right? The way New York City, I'm beating up on New York, that's my home city. I guess I can beat up on them a little bit, but broken windows policy that led to the choking death of Eric Garner for allegedly selling untaxed cigarettes. So, you know, keeping that in the back of your mind now, just think about in the early 90s, school systems started adopting this policy. And the intent was to prevent school shootings. So under federal law, the Gun-Free Schools Act, which is a portion of the No Child Left Behind law, there's a provision saying that if a student is found with a firearm on school campuses, the school district should adopt laws and policies that will require a 1-year expulsion from school. Well, states took that much further. They started adopting laws that would allow a person, a student, to be suspended, expelled, or arrested for minor things, such as disrespect of authority. So the problem with zero tolerance in the school setting is the same problem with it in the setting in policing. Teachers, like police, like all of us, come to their jobs with biases, right? For certain stereotypes and views of the populations that they, quote, serve. And so in the school setting, many teachers will interpret very subjective behavior like For example, kids of color are more expressive with their bodies, and they'll see that as a threat and, you know, punish that behavior more harshly than if that same behavior is exhibited by a white student. So in terms of what are some of the solutions? Well, first of all, like we have discussed, we have to address the implicit and explicit racial biases in the application of school discipline. How can that happen? Well, some teacher colleges would really need, that needs to be a part of the curriculum. Teachers need to recognize their own bias. And I invite all of you to take the implicit association test that Harvard University has. I took it. I thought it was very interesting what the results were. I mean, it's the types of biases that we all bring because we all have our personal experiences. And once we recognize it, we can stop ourselves when we're about to do something in our professions, whether you're a teacher, a police officer, or a lawyer, to prevent and minimize racial disparities in your professions. And then, although this may not be as popular, I think we have to pull police out of schools. There is no reason why police should be in schools. And in fact, police presence in schools could cause some of the behavior because many kids of color see police in their communities all the time, see the abuses that occur, and then they go to schools, which is supposed to be a safe space for them, and have police there as well harassing them. So I really think that police should be removed from schools and that replaced with counselors, other type of supportive services for young people to help them deal with some of the trauma that they are confronting every day in their communities.
Ms. Pierce, we know that social media is a very popular tool. In fact, it was very instrumental in terms of getting the SAE Act out there in public, as well as some other things. But it also allows people to create, share, and exchange information, ideas, pictures, videos, etc. It's also been used to catalyze political revolutions such as the Arab Spring a few years ago. In your view, can social media be used to engender social change in America today? And if so, how? And as well as more broadly, how can young people best engage in contemporary social justice movements?
Yeah, I think social media is definitely an organizing tool. I think we've seen it even, I think Arab Spring is a great case, but I think there's also a lot of cases here, especially when we look at what happened in Ferguson. You know, even when we think about not even just the organizing efforts that happened because of Ferguson, the establishment of Black Lives Matters. I just spent the whole weekend with the founders of Black Lives Matters and other folks talking about that work and how that came about. And so that I think that's a good example, but not just the organizing, I think also the education that happens because of tools like Twitter. Sometimes people negate because of like the social fun piece of it, right? So people are like, oh, I'm making a fun Vine. I don't Vine, but I have younger cousins that do. And I'm like, this is ridiculous, but a lot of things, like when we look at SAE, it happens because people did put things like that out on Vine. But even the education piece, with Ferguson, for example, there was the hashtag that was created, which was Ferguson syllabus. And so what happened is, as a direct response, there were teachers and educators that started creating tools for other teachers and educators to use and find. And I think that that story isn't told a lot, and I think that that's an important piece because part of the work of this movement is not just organizing the actions and the die-ins and like the fun campaign pieces and the direct actions and the civil disobedience, but there also is a necessary ongoing political education, politicizing that has to happen within our community. So I think the Ferguson syllabus piece is something I always come back to when I talk about Twitter. And also just the fact that the people that are using Twitter the most at this point are young Black people. So it's us that are on it, so whatever we put out there, it has the potential to really go big and go huge. Last week I put out one tweet that ended up being retweeted by Big Boy from Outkast, and it went way farther than I ever could have anticipated, but it was a helpful moment because it was talking about Tony Robinson and the actions and the works that was happening in the Capitol in Wisconsin, right? So like, it's an education and an organizing tool, and I think that the more that people use it, the more helpful it is, and I also think it makes it so that nobody can really hide anymore, which is a good thing. It's a scary thing, right? But it's also a good thing because things can't just happen anymore and just get covered up everything is public at this point. And I think that that's a helpful piece that we always have to come back to with social media. And then I think the other thing is, the second part of the question is more of just like, how do people get into this work? I think it's very simple things, even when we're looking at Twitter and we're looking at offline organizing. It's things like the hashtag Black Lives Matter. You know, using that hashtag when something happens in your community allows it to go farther than just your community. It connects us to the point where we're taking a story of one person, when we're making a martyr a movement. Very practically. I also think it's embracing Black Lives Matters, and at the same time, if I'm being very honest from my perspective, it's also not embracing certain hashtags like All Lives Matters. It's the same reason why, very fundamentally, I don't call myself a person of color. I call myself Black. Because what happens, you know, like Gerhard just really talked about, is that when we push out those narratives, it's a further erasure of Black communities and our stories. You know, it's the reason why a lot of times, like right now, people will talk about hate crimes in Arizona, for example, right? Which has been a huge conversation around the immigration movement. You know, people are being asked to show their papers, right? That was a huge thing. Immigration movement touted that out there, right? But what's funny is that even in the state of Arizona, is that there's 4% African-American Black people in the state of Arizona, and still the majority of hate crimes, the victims are Black people. So even in this narrative in other spaces, right, where, you know, a lot of times in the immigration community, it is a narrative that ends up still being anti-Black, which is why I talk about being a Black person in this work. We have to make sure that we are very careful about what we choose to embrace and not embrace, right? So there's a reason why I say Black Lives Matter and I don't say All Lives Matter. You know, there's a reason why I reject respectability politics in a lot of ways too, right? So like, I love that everyone is in here and dressed up and in your suits, right? I still don't own a suit to this day, if I'm being honest. That's why I don't have one on. But that's okay, right? Because the reality of the situation is that you being in a suit, a Black man in a suit, is not going to save your life. And in a lot of ways, we can make the comparison to say, people will say, well, you know, if you just dressed up or if you just pulled up your pants, right? I saw a story of a father talking about how he keeps his kids not wearing hoodies because that's going to keep them safe. Well, that's like saying that a woman won't get raped if she just wears pants and doesn't wear a skirt, right? And we know that that doesn't work. In that same way, that is a respectability politics that continues to dominate these narratives, and we have to reject that in a way and embrace people for where they're at, who they're at, and understand that Blackness looks like all of us in different ways, and that everybody is an expert in their own experience, right? So like, even when I talk about education, right, I'll be honest, I attended institution of higher education. I did not graduate from an institution of higher education. I made the choice not to do that very purposefully because I saw the education that I existed within and the people that I was working with and the people I loved being forced to have to represent institutional racism in a lot of ways, being forced to have to profitize education, right? Like, there's no reason why professors in institutions of public education are now being asked how they can become revenue generating departments. Like, that is literally a conversation I have with my friends who are still in the education system, right? So for me, it's really just about starting where you're at, but also controlling the narrative, and as much as we can, embracing that, you know, a lot of this that we're combating is anti-racist. It is very much also anti-Black, and that shouldn't be scary to people. Anti-Black does not mean anti-white. Just like reverse racism doesn't exist, just like Black on Black crime doesn't exist, right? All of these things that like are a part of the education piece, I believe that is the base of the ongoing organizing that has to happen too.
Right. So thank you to you all. I want to ask I want us to talk about the problem of microaggressions, and I'm going to open this up to all of our panelists, and I'm not sure that everyone here is familiar with the idea, but microaggressions, right, it's commonly defined as the casual, sometimes unintended degradation of any socially marginalized group. So I'd like to pose the following questions. Maybe first, if someone could say more about what sorts of words or actions might be seen as falling into the category of microaggressions, how, if these are different from blatant racism or explicit racism, if they're more dangerous, what can be done to counter microaggressions, and finally, if in the course of your life, your professional life, you felt this has happened to you, and what did you do to deal with it?
Yes, very quickly. I just want to say that I think microaggressions have probably happened to all of us, but when you look at the structural inequality in a racial state like the United States, obviously it has implications beyond the feelings we have when we see these things happen. But I want to talk about it in the context of what Martin King seemed to be trying to say and where do we go from here. He's trying to imagine a society that doesn't exist and that maybe has never existed in world history. One where people are attempting to speak to each other with language they are inventing in real time through a shared struggle around a principle of a beloved community. And what does that mean? Let me make that very concrete. When I came in here tonight, right, and Belemma, you have done an incredible job, brother. Looking at your last name, and I work at Howard, right? One of the things I love about Howard is, Kwame Ture said this, Stokely Carmichael, said at Howard University you have everything in the black world and its opposite. So whatever you into, it's a black version of it at Howard. And it's not just only black people at Howard, obviously there's a lot of different people, but the core critical mass of folks are of African descent. So I have a lot of students in my class who are Nigerian, all right? And I think I met at least one young person who is in Balsa whose folks are Yoruba, right? Who was it? Your people Yoruba, huh? Yeah, because I could tell by your last name, right? I guess Belemma's people are Igbo, but no, he said Calabar. That's serious business in Nigeria. Now, they're going to have an election in Nigeria in the next few weeks, and whoever's going to be the president, I hope one day I get the invitation from you because you're going to be being inaugurated as president of Nigeria. So we're going to come sit in on your Nigerian, on your inauguration. But the groups that are not Igbo, well, the groups that are not Igbo, not Yoruba, not Hausa in Nigeria, get papered over in the narrative of the Nigerian state. How does that connect to Martin Luther King and microaggressions? That caused a civil war almost 50 years ago. Chinua Achebe wrote, the last book he wrote before he died was There Was a Country. He's Igbo. People read things fall apart, but you gotta understand, the Igbos wanted to pull out, but they're on the land where the oil is, which means you can't lead a state, and that caused war. I'm sure, Professor Wing, when I look at the South African Constitution, and my colleague at Howard Law, Professor Matala, helped work on that document, that's a brilliant document because what they're trying to imagine is a construct that hasn't existed yet. That's what King is talking about. But the villain of this piece is the nation state. A state is a system of laws. A nation is an idea, a common ancestry. Anytime you reach somebody and speak to them out of their identity and there are power implications at play, a microaggression can be turned into a structural disadvantage. In Nigeria, people who say, I identify with this group, I speak this language, I worship this way, were punished because of that. We see that, it's funny we talk about the Arab Spring because there is no springtime in North Africa, but again, we're superimposing narratives and languages. But they have a popular election and the Muslim Brotherhood cat wins, which means the United States say, oh, hell no, you can't do that. So now Egypt has a new version of the strong man that was there before, but all's right with the world because the state has not yet figured out a way to have people who are from different backgrounds live in a space where their humanity can be recognized and also populated with a type of power that will have them say, oh, you mispronounced my name, but it's cool. Nah, you mispronounced my name, and as you said, I'm so glad you said that, if you have a name that sounds like it's black, what's this? Is it the equivalent of what, 6 months having served a prison sentence? I'm trying to think of some of them. In other words, if you say my name is Shaquita Johnson, you don't get a call back for the job. Is that a microaggression? Black women, I know black men too, but black women, this is the last thing I'll say, black women, because I worked for the School District of Philadelphia for a number of years and I still did consulting work with them even when I was at Howard. I saw this every day. These little girls of African descent who would come in, some of this happened to y'all. Elementary school, middle school, and the teacher just jacked their name up and they want to give them a nickname. Can I just call you Shay? I heard her call you Shay. No, you don't know me like that. That's a microaggression, but you've set up a system of hostility where now that child don't want to take a test from you. But you're going to put her in a category and say she's dumb. No, she is now withholding the only thing she has, which is what? Her identity. And I guess what I'm saying is that in a nation state that rewards that kind of behavior, microaggressions have real consequences. And so what King is talking about, and where do we go from here, is really he's trying to build the concept that people have to first determine who they are and then have other people respect it. He deals very seriously in that piece with the question of culture and self-determination and self-respect and self-pride. And he's talking to black people. That's a conversation we don't really have. So I think microaggressions in that respect is a question of the nation state. And I don't know how you solve the question of the nation state because it's a deeply flawed way of governing, but I don't know that there's any better one that's been invented yet.
Professor Cummings.
Not specifically to microaggressions, but I wanted to say something very specifically about what Brother Carr said earlier. To any non-black person in this room, when we drive home tonight, and get pulled over by the police, we are not going to think we are going to be shot dead. And that might be the ultimate microaggression, is the fact that I never drive my car thinking that I'm getting stopped because of my race or that my life's in danger with law enforcement. And you know, that is the ultimate white privilege, is white privilege allows us to live in a world where where we think we're going to get the job because we got a good resume, not because our name's jacked up to the person viewing the resume, or the fact that we're going to get shot and killed because of our race simply. And so I just want to point out how profound that white privilege is and how devastating the microaggressions are that continue. It's not, you know, I was thinking about Eric Garner just the other day, you know, and I was thinking of police dogs and hoses in Alabama, Birmingham. We're not much past that. They're not bringing police dogs and hoses out, but they are bringing chokeholds out, and they're choking people to death. And I never have to worry about that. And that's white privilege, and that's something that I think white people need to recognize and that we need to figure out a way in our country to address.
And let me add a comment to that, especially as a young black male professor. And you know, it's really interesting you talk about this idea of driving home and getting stopped by the police and what do you think? And you know, I'm here at William & Mary, faculty member, but something that I do not do in my own neighborhood here in this nice suburban Williamsburg, I don't walk my dog at night. I just don't. And not that I've had some sort of experience personally that made me fearful of my own neighborhood, but I know enough about history that I don't want one neighbor to kind of mistake me, call somebody, and there's a whole lot of back and forth, and who knows where it goes from there. I don't do that. And that's tough to, you know, think about because, you know, you're taught when you're young, oh, go to school, get this education, do all these great things, and no title is going to protect me from that. No suit is going to protect me from that. And that's my reality. Now, thinking about microaggressions in the sense of my day-to-day activity, we had some visiting students come in a couple weeks ago, and it's really interesting. This is more fascinating now. I can chuckle and laugh about it. But when newly admitted students come in and they're talking about issues, I can't tell you how many times that the newly admitted students ask me, hey, so what do you do here? It happens. And that's really fascinating because I can't think of any graduate school visit I went on or you all for law school visits you went to where you didn't have a sense of who the faculty were, what they study, what's their interest, and then you can have a conversation about that. My conversation is, who are you? And that's reality. And then outside of the academy, my experiences, I was flying back to Williamsburg and I was wearing a William & Mary sweatshirt. You know, it's cool. William & Mary is the label that pays me. You know, I'm representing. And boarding the flight to come on, this gentleman that's just in front of me says, oh, you know, William & Mary, great school. You know what he asked me? He says, am I an athlete? Do I run track and field? Of all the things I could possibly do, and I never played a sport on the college level? Am I a track and field athlete? So when you think about those things and how that piles up day after day, both on campus and off campus, it's a very, very important conversation to have, and it's a reality that I deal with. And so even something as simple as sitting on this symposium, this panel, think about the reward system for a faculty member. I'm a pre-tenure faculty member, so if I have 2 hours to spare between on a Tuesday evening, am I going to sit on a panel and talk about racial issues, or am I going to work on a journal article or a book chapter? Research and teaching is what's rewarded, not necessarily this form of service.
I call the microaggressions in my work spirit injury. The psychological aspect of any ism, racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia. And so people of color, women, different groups that are disadvantaged, you have these microaggressions or these spirit injuries. Maybe a person of privilege sees one of them. Oh, so-and-so called you the N-word. That was really bad. They don't see the many dozens of these that add up. And when you get enough of them, I call it spirit murder. Professor Patricia Williams of Columbia Law School wrote an article about spirit murdering the messenger. When your spirit is murdered, which is what happens with many people of color, you may commit homicide or suicide. Doesn't matter what country you're in. You could be a Muslim person in France who feels disrespected, and some of those people may end up joining the global jihad. And then we're all wondering, how did this happen? What do we do? Because we're not seeing these many thousands of these injuries that add up to macroaggression. And until we as a world and as a society figure out how do we even know these things are happening, we can't treat them. If racism is just a little aberrational spot on my skin, the treatment for that is a Band-Aid. But if racism, sexism, homophobia, and so on are cancers ravaging the body, then we need other treatments. Law can give us some of the treatments for these microaggressions. Some, but not all.
Well, thank you all. And now we would very much like to take any questions that any of you may have for our panelists. So there are, I think, 4 microphones down front, and
So ask a bunch of questions at once. Ask a bunch and then let us respond.
all right. I think that is a good suggestion. So we will, so those of you, I see 4 who are standing. I think that we'll take all 4 of your questions, and then the panelists will respond. Oh.
Yeah, one. We have one question. Come on now.
I'm sorry?
3.
No, they're just holding. Who has? Oh.
All right. Well, first, thank you for coming. I'm glad you all able to make it. I'm actually a graduate student here in American Studies. I want to make a statement first and ask 2 questions. So about the Clarence Thomas question, and also along with that, you have Ben Carson, Larry Elder. I do want us to remember that they too have been through the system. So they have experienced institutional racism, and a part of that teaches black self-hate. So you just wonder the internal gymnastics that they might deal with and struggle with on that they may not be able to articulate. So just we keep that within the framework. But one, so we're thinking about King, and I always want to push for this when I have the chance, and I'll eventually get to the question, but first, we can't have King without Claudette Colvin. And I bring up Claudette Colvin because eventually we get to Rosa Parks on the bus boycott, but they wanted to have the boycott surrounding Claudette Colvin first, but back to your notion of respectability, she eventually got pregnant. So they said, oh, we can't rally around Claudette Colvin because she got pregnant. I use Claudette Colvin as an example because we had, after after Rosa Parks got arrested for the boycott, 5,000 blacks came to church that night. How many, the thing is, how many of those black women were physically and sexually abused by Mississippi police officer at that time period? And then a great book about this is The Dark End of the Street, which basically draws out the history of sexual violence against black women. And I want to highlight that because we can't talk about the civil rights movement without talking about the sexual violence against black women. And that's a major component of the movement that is quite often left out of the narrative. So if we could talk about, along those lines, you see the tremendous contribution of black women to the civil rights movement. I mean, they were the ones who were making the drafts to schools being segregated. They were the ones who were leading the fundraisers, raising thousands of dollars just for the movement to go forth. So if we can, so to add to the conversation, because y'all make some comments about the contribution of black women to the civil rights movement. Actually, that'd be good enough. I'll go with that.
I will totally respond to that really quick. There's other questions?
Yeah, and then please.
Back a little bit. Okay, there you go. That works. So this is a question for the whole panel, but addressed specifically sort of to Professor Cummings, who talked the most about the police aspect of this panel. So he referenced the state laws that protect police use of violence, particularly deadly violence. And these laws were mainly derived from several Supreme Court decisions that basically said police actions had to be judged based on what police officers knew and believed at the time. And so my question is, do you think this is justified? Do you think this is a correct way to judge police decisions and police actions? And how would you wish to change laws so that police violence is diminished? Thank you.
Do we have reason to be optimistic, or do you see a trend toward more implicit racism? You talked about microaggressions, and a trend toward complacency as a result of less salient racism.
Thank you. Maybe we'll take one more question and then we'll answer that group of questions and see where we are time-wise. There's someone standing at microphone 3.
Hi. Actually, I wanted the panel to address the issue of kind of the working class and kind of the abandonment of working class agenda and working class agency. I think that since the 1970s especially, the working class in the United States has been abandoned in general, and in particular the black middle class, or black working class. And so a lot of problems, I think, have their core in the economic problems that resulted from that. I mean, including job discrimination, employment discrimination, but deindustrialization in general in America's cities. And as long as that problem is not addressed, how can we solve the problems of race relations at all? You can't just solve policing and then leave the economic problem still there. It's always going to regenerate, and the problem's going to always resurface as long as we don't have, like a full employment policy or things like that. And so have we, kind of middle class leadership abandoned, working class needs, and how can we, move forward from that, or like, include that in the agenda.
Jessica, you were going to go with
Oh, yeah. So the first piece about the women in the civil rights movement, I think is, I mean, I clearly talk about that all the time, especially after coming out of the NAACP and even like finding the old papers of Rosa Parks, right, and Ella Baker and these women that worked in the NAACP in positions also that weren't often given a lot of credit, right? Like they were secretaries, right? They weren't presidents. And so a lot of times, even in how we talk about leaders, right, we always talk about the person who's at the mic, not the person that actually made the meeting happen, right? And so usually the person at the mic is, unfortunately, someone who's male presenting, and usually the person running behind the scenes is a woman that's running around behind the scenes, and nobody ever knows her name. In a lot of ways, that was Ella Baker, or that was Rosa Parks in the NAACP. And so I think the question of, you know, how do we talk about their contributions, I think is one, we have to realize that every single contribution that we can trace back is representative of so many people's stories that we don't often hear, right? So like I think about the stories of the women, but I also think about stories of like Bayard Rustin, and how people don't talk about the fact that this was a gay black man who made so much of our freedom work of the civil rights movement in the heyday of it happen, right? But people don't talk about his story, or they don't talk about the fact that he was a gay man, right? They'll talk about him, and they'll absent that key identity piece, which is really important, right? So I think part of it is that we have to take on a responsibility to also retell these stories also, because I think as black people, a lot of our power and a lot of our strength and a lot comes back to our storytelling in a lot of ways. And that is a part of our culture. And so I think recognizing that power in that story and retelling those stories as much as we can is really powerful. And then in terms of how we do it in our own work is that we retell those stories in our BYP 100 chapters. We have affirmation exercises and songs that we sing where we literally call our ancestors into the space so that if you don't know, you do know by the time that you leave. We also really focus on that political education and training piece. That's the piece that I've done. I've trained 40,000 people between the United States and Australia, and that's the work that I do, is that I go out and I focus on political education, I focus on tools, and I focus on storytelling, and I tell these stories every single time. As repetitive as it may seem for me, there's always somebody new in the room who's hearing that for the first time, and I just think about, and a really easy way to localize it is I think the story of Rosa Parks. You know, I grew up in California in the Bay Area, which is really diverse, but I was the only black person in a lot of my classes. And when I first heard the story of Rosa Parks and how they told it, it was like she was really tired and she just, you know, sat down on the bus, and then all of a sudden there was a movement, right? And I was like, oh, you know, and being the black girl in the room, they were like, Jessica, we're gonna do a retelling of it and you're gonna be Rosa Parks. And I was like, I'm so powerful in this moment because look what I started a movement, right? Like, quite literally. But in the retelling of that story in that way, we focus again on the individual power as opposed to actually focusing on the collective power of the work that happened before that, right? With Claudette, with the NAACP, with focusing on the buses because it was the one place where we had economic power, which I think then also goes back to the question the gentleman asked lastly about the working class agenda in the economy. And I think it's the piece of saying that, like, we're being attacked on every level, not just our identities, but also anything that's important to us, right? It's no surprise that in all of the states where we're attacking voting rights, we're also attacking the right of labor unions to organize. We're also attacking women's health, right? Like, we're all, like, they're attacking everything because those are all of the things that are important to our lives. And it isn't just a conversation about, you know, racism. It isn't just a conversation about violence or mass incarceration. It's a conversation about institutions that have been perpetuating this, which appear in the form of incarceration. They appear in the form of criminal violence. They also appear in the form of not having jobs in these communities. In cities like Detroit, where 50% of the black men were unemployed a couple of years ago, right? Like, this is, it is a system and it is an institution, and the power that we have is to bring that all together and to talk about all those issues in a way that doesn't limit it, right? That all of these issues are human rights and civil rights issues, right? It's not just civil rights is only talking about race. No, it's talking about race in the presence of all of these other issues. Our power is to focus on building, focusing on those institutions, and actually creating change within those institutions that impacts and improves people's lives in a sustainable way.
Professor Cummings, the standards that are used to govern and judge police
I wanted
violence.
to take 15 seconds and just mention that each speaker tonight has said something profound to me that I hadn't thought of before. And even removing me from the equation, I just really want to thank the organizers for putting this thing together. This has been really deep, and I hope that it leads to action, because it's been really impressive to me. And so I wanted to thank all the panelists for your really deep thinking and conversations. Thank you for the question on deadly force. If you read Darrell Wilson's testimony that he gave during his indictment, it's as if he tracked the language of the law to be able to justify his killing. And so when you have Supreme Court decisions and laws on the books that sort of say, here's what you can do to use deadly force, then when you testify, you say things like, I was in fear for my life. And then you racialize it and say this big brute of an animal like leapt inside my car, and before you know it, you've just given a blueprint for how to justify your behavior for killing. And so Supreme Court decisions and state law, I think we need to flip it. And I liked what Brother Carr said earlier about reform, as if there was ever a system that wasn't set up to, perpetuate racism and destruction anyway. But we need to radically reform or reconstitute, I don't know what the right word is, but we need to reconstitute the way we do policing. And it has to start here. The law has to talk about preserving human life as the fundamental basic importance. Not what you can do to use deadly force, but what can you do to preserve life. And then we need to adopt a whole bunch of reconstitutions like body cameras on all officers, videos in all police officers' cars, preservation of human life as a fundamental importance, training on implicit bias, training on all of your toolbox of weapons that you can use that are not the double tap to center mass. So here's what's exciting to me about you all, is that you all graduate, pass your bar exam, go and do the work you're going to do, and write draft legislation. Become partners with legislators and say, I have an idea on how to eradicate our deadly force law, and here's what it is. Preserving human life, training for police officers, and you're activist in that way such that you can help to perpetuate the change that we need, the reconstitution that we need. And to the young brother that talked about optimism. Sometimes when you have panels about where we are and where we're going, it can get kind of depressing. But I'm not depressed. I'm hugely optimistic. This is why. I believe that if my research turns up that Victoria's Secret uses prison labor to sew their undergarments, which I think they do, I've just got to tie a couple of more knots together to get there, then I'm going to ask my students to go with me to Victoria's Secret and sit in that joint and hold some boycott signs up and say, Victoria's Secret, now I know this is being recorded and I don't want to libel anybody, but I'm pretty sure that there are corporations that are, I know there are corporations that are profiting from prison labor. Georgia and Wisconsin do not pay their prisoners anything. $0 and 0 cents per hour. That's indentured servitude, that's slavery. If we can call Victoria's Secret out, or IBM or McDonald's or any of the other corporations benefiting, and we put a few protest signs up, they're going to stop using private prison labor. They will, because they don't want that publicity. And that's just a small example of the kind of activism that we can engage in, drafting legislation, becoming connected to legislators, giving them your ideas of draft legislation, and sitting in and boycotting and being really aggressive about the things that we want to change. I'm hugely optimistic about those things. And like Professor Wing said earlier tonight, y'all have your world in front of you, your future. I mean, you can be lawyer activists that can literally change the way we do law in the United States. I deeply believe that. That's why I'm a law professor, because I believe that we can change the law for the better in this country. We have to.
I just want to add to that. We've been focusing much on the use of deadly force, but there are incidents of use of excessive force happening all the time. And while it will take a while to change the standard of the deadly use of force by police, the one thing that could happen right away is national data collection on use of force incidents, excessive use of force incidents, and have it publicly published. And then require police officers, supervisors in particular, to review that data on a regular basis and start imposing some sanctions on officers. Darren Wilson had use of force incidents in his record. Then he was allowed to police Ferguson without carrying a taser. So he didn't have the full array of tools available to him to preserve life, right? And so one way to address, prevent the use of deadly force is to collect the data, analyze it, impose sanctions before deadly force is used within our police departments.
I got to jump on that really quick, Monique. That was excellent. I'm sorry. David Dante Trout, in that article I suggested that you read, says that we should get to a point in society where we abhor police brutality just as much as we abhor murder and rape and pedophilia. We have got to get to a place where we abhor police brutality, where any excessive use of force is an affront to all of us. And Brother Cole just reminded me that Darren Wilson just had an enormously successful fundraiser to pay for his legal costs, I'm guessing, or buy a house for him. I don't know. He's not a police officer anymore. But, you know, we literally have a society that we have to educate. And forums like these are important for us, I think, to do that.
To speak about the sexual violence, I've written about what I call insider-outsider violence. If you have oppressed communities anywhere in the world, and I've happened to write about South Africa and Palestine, the oppressed people in those communities, the men in those communities are not allowed to do the socially constructed definition of masculinity. Those oppressed men are not allowed to be running the country, running the economy, running the educational institutions, etc. Instead, they are overrepresented in prison. This is around the world. Okay, where can they take out their rage? On their families. Most violence against people is within the family. So I have speculated you're going to have disproportional amounts of violence, which some people call domestic violence, or you could call it terrorism in the house, that is going to be against family members, which could be predominantly wives, girlfriends, and children. And yet, until recently, this was not even a crime in the US, and in many parts of the world, it is still not a crime, or if it is a crime, the customs are so deeply rooted that nobody's going to be prosecuted for this kind of thing. So you say, yes, this is a problem, what do you do? Well, in South Africa, one of those 3 constitutions I worked on, they have a section that says everyone has the right to be free from private and public violence. They were concerned not only about the legacy of apartheid and what the state had done, but also to the bigger issue of violence within the family structure. And that is a constitutional provision. I know it's very hard to ever change our Constitution. We have very few amendments over 200 years. But if we get to a point where some of you all will be in office on the state and national level, as I'm sure some of you will be, we have to start talking about how do we take our 18th century Constitution and drag it, kicking and screaming, into the 21st century.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up. No, I think just for the sake of time. We're already over time. So we have one last question for all the panelists.
I just have I really want to ask this question. I'm sorry. I just want to ask this quick question. It seems like we have attacked the civil rights movement and racism through a legal realm and through the public sector and also through legislation and things like that. But I'm a lawyer myself, and I don't speak from a deal lawyer. I do a bunch of deals, hundreds of deals, a year. And what I've come to see is there's a bunch of regulations, there's a number of regulations in our deals that you have to follow, but what I've seen in my short tenure of being a lawyer is that he who has the gold has the power. So, when we have certain provisions that we have to add to these operating agreements, we have certain provisions that these borrowers and lenders council and everybody has to follow, whoever has the most money pretty much can write their own way how they want to structure the deal. So my question is there any way that we can use or we can transfer our attack towards racism or towards civil rights movement to infiltrate the private sector rather than the public sector to make a difference in that way, to make them feel it economically, financially? Because if they're not feeling it, I mean, we have a black president, we have the Civil Rights Act 1964, we have all these various cases that are supposedly supposed to give us rights. However, if they're not feeling it in their pocket, what gives the overarching foundation, or whatever you want to call it, umbrella, motive or a kick in the butt to actually do something if they're not feeling it for their own children? Because I guess that's their livelihood.
Actually, that's actually there couldn't have been a better question, observation to bring us back to where Martin King started in August of '67. The book, Where We Go From Here, is a book clearly, but the talk he gave, Where Do We Go From Here, to SNCC, as I said, it was the theme. He opens that talk by saying he had just come back from Cleveland. And I don't know, in the South, we had, some of y'all know about Seal Test ice cream. Do they still make ice cream, Seal Test? I don't remember. But at any rate, in '67, they were making Seal Test ice cream, and they were making it in Cleveland. And King said they went to Seal Test because they weren't hiring any black people. They weren't advertising in the black newspapers, and they didn't have money in the black banks. So what they wanted to do was build wealth in the black banks that could then turn around and subsidize folks who wanted to buy their houses in Cleveland. Economics, in other words. This is where the civil rights movement starts. It's an economic action in Montgomery, right? King says the Seal Test owners said, no, we're not interested in that. So then they went to A&P and said, y'all need to take this Seal Test stuff out y'all's stores or we're going to boycott y'all. A&P agreed to do it. And A&P put money in the black banks in Cleveland, and A&P started hiring black people, and A&P advertised in the black newspapers. I think the Cleveland paper is the Call and Post, the black newspaper, right? Seal Test, King reports, and where do we go from here? This is the talk he's giving it to the SCLC convention in Atlanta. He says, well, Mr. Seal Test, and then in the caption you see applause. And if you listen to the tape, everybody starts, before he can get to the moral of the story, because you know what happened. Seal Test comes running and begs, please, wait, A&P told us they're going to take the ice cream out. Okay, we're going to hire some black people, we're going to advertise in the black newspapers, and we're going to put money in the black bank. Jesse Jackson took that. That was Operation Breadbasket, by the way, which was SCLC's economic arm. King gets killed, Jackson leaves SCLC, starts Operation Push, and Jesse Jackson has been doing it for the last 40 years. The problem, and this is where I conclude, you have put your finger on it. The power of the consumer is the power to reshape the political economy. But if you don't have anything to spend, then you can't consume in the same way, which is why King, in Where Do We Go From Here, says you have to put an economic floor under every human being in this state. Because every human being has the right to live indoors, eat food, raise their family, and be secure economically. And if you can't do that, then we need to stop this conversation. At the end of his life, the last words out of his mouth just about were the issue you just raised. That's it.
Okay. Panelists, what advice might you offer our audience, particularly our students, who will soon be young leaders in the legal field as well as other professions, as to the work they can do to help eradicate racial injustices in society today? And I guess we can start with Professor Cole and work our way all the way to Ms. Pierce.
And since our time is, I think I've been turned off.
Since our time is very limited, we will ask that you keep your remarks to 30 seconds.
Okay.
When I think about the future of activism and where we're going, I think about Dr. King's mountaintop speech, his last speech in Memphis in April of 1968. And in that speech, in my analysis of rhetoric, it's really interesting to think that he had made peace with himself in a lot of ways that he would not necessarily see the change that he was working toward, but he had complete faith and left motivation for others to continue to push forward. So as we think about ourselves as young people moving forward, continue to fight, even if we may not have the opportunity ourselves to see the difference. We want to work toward the future.
I've said a lot of things already tonight about what I think we can do to be activists. So the last thing I would say is just simply believe that you can make a difference. You know, believe that your law degree or your, graduate degree can be used to make this a better, safer, saner place to live, especially for oppressed peoples. I believe it. I teach my students. I try to live it. And I hope that you all can, as you get into your careers, speaking to the students in particular, remember that part of the reason that you got a JD or a graduate degree was to improve the condition. And we've talked a lot tonight about how it can be improved. But there's so much good work that can be done. Just use your degree to do that good work.
I gave you a lot of tips. I hope some of you all will get involved in elected politics, appointive politics. You all are part of a global elite of people who've had tertiary level education. Yes, you all won't be multi-billionaires, but you will still have more money than most people in the world, including most black people, most women. And if you choose to use a little bit of your resources toward the struggle for justice, and whether that's writing checks to the Legal Defense Fund, or getting involved in Human Rights First, or supporting one of your colleagues who has the courage to run for an elective office, all of that will be very valuable. There are people who want to see us eliminated from these institutions of learning and power. And even if they eliminate affirmative action, there's going to be a whole bunch of us over the next few decades who are still out there, and we have to continue to be committed to that on the front line of the struggle. And I am optimistic that these young people and what they've done here and what the faculty has done at William & Mary, that they're going to be at the forefront. And that, like I said, I may not get to the promised land with you on the mountaintop, but it's going to happen. That doesn't mean racism ends. It means, though, that we will move forward as a nation and as a planet.
I'm listening there. I'm like Professor Cummings. Brother, that's right. I'm learning so much here tonight. Thank you all for inviting us, and thanks for having this conversation. And I would just leave you with, I'm primarily a classroom teacher. That's what I do. And I learned so much from listening. Read, education, and get some children, those 7, 8, 9-year-olds. Let them be around you, and not just as mentors. No, help them read, because the more you understand, the more you will say, this condition, I will not tolerate it anymore. And when a child reads, when a child does deep study, I don't equate education with reading and study. I agree with you on that. That's not. Degrees are licenses, like a driver's license. It's no evidence of whether you can drive or not. You just passed the test. Deep education makes people find their condition is untenable. And not only thank you all for allowing us, Dean, I meant to say this to you, Dean Douglas. I meant to say this because the light went on when they read that you wrote Jim Crow Moves North. I have students in my Education in Black America class who I have read chapters out of that book. When they begin to realize, see, when you're a scholar, you produce things that can change people's lives, but only if they read it. Y'all have the best thing in the world, time to read. Share that with a child and watch the whole world change. That's what I would leave y'all with.
And just to piggyback on that, my advice is to reach back. You can go forward with your careers, do great things, but remember your history and bring someone along with you. Every opportunity I have to go and speak with students, particularly law students, I go. Because I remember being in law school and wanting to see people who look like me, sitting on panels, opining about different things. And you would be surprised at the impact that it has on the person who's hearing it. And you know, my president, director counsel, Sherilyn Eiffel, was my law school professor. The first year of law school, I had an African-American female professor teaching me civil rights law. And clearly that had an impact, because now I'm working for her, right? And so you just don't take for granted the impact you have. Even if you don't do civil rights work, you can reach back and make sure that other people behind you see you and understand what you're doing and help them to remember their history and to continue to move forward with the struggle.
Yeah, I think for me, the first piece of it is, I assume everybody in this room isn't necessarily going to become a lawyer. There's probably, like other folks said, there were different focuses of what they're working on right now. One thing that a lot of people in this movement are asking for folks to pay attention to is kind of the new 4 strongholds of power in this country. And so people are looking at Hollywood and Silicon Valley and then Wall Street and DC. So even in thinking about the different types of law that you all may practice, like looking at those 4 places and thinking about the potential of change in each of those areas, which I think with the last question too is kind of around that when we think about economic power and Wall Street and what comes out of that and how it does still come back to this work in a lot of ways. And I think then the last 2 pieces for me are out of the Midwest Academy School of Training and Organizing, there's 3 things that I always try to do. And the first thing is making people aware of their own power. The second thing is then altering the relations of power that exist with the institutions we interface with. And then the last thing is improving and creating lasting change that improves people's lives. And so for me, those are the 3 things that I always come back to every day, just to make sure that the things that I've done every day, even if it may not seem like I've made major progress, that I can figure out how in some way the work that I've done has come back to those 3 areas. And I think even just basically fundamentally, lastly, just speaking to the Black folks in the room, thinking about the economic power that we do have, because I do think, again, a lot of this does come back to economics in a lot of ways, is that, you know, Black people actually do, we have like something over like 1 trillion, I think, in wealth in this country that we have. But in terms of buying and spending power, our dollar only stays in Black communities a little over 6 hours in comparison to white communities where it stays in their communities for about 20 days. So just even thinking about like very fundamentally, right? You know, how are we spending the money that we have? You know, are we going to Victoria's Secret, right? Or are we, you know, looking at someone locally who is doing this and selling the same product and honestly probably even for cheaper, right? So I think that sometimes, a lot of times we talk about this work in really big ways about how we can all be activists, and I think that that's a great thing. I want everyone who wants to be an activist to claim that and own that title, but in the same way of just everyday practical terms, thinking about how we radicalize our everyday actions.
Thank you. In concluding this part of our conversation, I would like to thank, of course, BLSA and our organizers and co-sponsors, William and Mary, Dean Douglas, for being here. I also want to thank all of you for being here. I see graduates, former students, people who are in practice, people who have traveled from other places. And I think that it's inspiring to all of us to see that so many of you, and students, current students, who obviously have such busy lives, care enough about all of these issues to spend this evening here, engaging with the issues and engaging with our panelists. And finally, I want to thank our panelists who all traveled here and have generously spent so much time with us and inspired us. Thank you. Thank you all.